Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. I'm Dan Katz. I believe that this is our last NCSA colloquium for the calendar year. So thanks to everybody who's come to other ones as well, and we'll look forward to seeing people again in I think in mid-January, if I remember right. So today we have Jeff Carver, who's going to talk about software engineering, particularly related to scientific software. And Jeff is an associate professor in computer science at the University of Alabama, who's worked on empirical software engineering and specifically human factors. And for the last decade, he's been looking at how scientific software is developed by looking at case studies of scientific software teams and software as a product as well. And he's one of the primary organizers also of the Software Engineering for Science workshop series, which I hope he'll advertise towards the end.
Cool. Right. Thank you. Again, thanks for coming. Just as I get started, just to kind of give me an idea of where everybody comes from, and while my slides are coming up, how many people would consider themselves primarily a software engineer? How many people primarily a scientist of some kind? How many people somewhere in the middle doing both? Okay, so I've got a good mix here. So hopefully all of you will find something interesting, maybe different parts of it. What I want to kind of go through today is just a brief overview of a series of things that I've done over the last number of years in engaging with the scientific software community from a software engineer's perspective. So as Dan mentioned, my background, my training is in empirical software engineering, especially in human factors. That is, how do people develop software and how can we help them do that better? And so along those lines, I'm going to talk briefly about some surveys that we have performed across the scientific and engineering software community to get some ideas of what people are doing and what people are thinking. Then I'm going to give a brief overview of some case studies that we did a number of years ago that kind of gave me a good sense of what's going on in the community. Some of the things in there you might recognize, some might be different experiences for you. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about a workshop series that I co-organize. I'm going to give you a little bit of kind of the background and some of the things we've done in there, tell you about the next one coming up. Hopefully I can interest some people in submitting papers or attending. And then what I want to spend the last little bit talking about is kind of where things are going now, some of the more direct interactions, some of the ongoing work that might be of interest, or there might be some ideas for other things that any of you may have. So briefly about the couple of surveys that we've done. I have a lot more on these, but I'm going to give you a few highlights. We did 2 surveys. In the first survey, we sent this out to a broad range of scientific and engineering developers that we had access to by one of our collaborators. And their basic question was trying to understand, do they think that they have sufficient software engineering knowledge to do their job of building software? And so the results came back that the people who answered the survey, personally, they said, almost all of them said, yes, I've got enough knowledge. I didn't put the team up there. The team was a little bit less. Their team had knowledge, and then the community a lot less. So either we got the best people, or everybody has a much higher view of themselves than they do of the community. I don't know. We also observed, and again, some of this may not be new, there's a bit of a difference between research, people who are doing primarily research code, people who are doing primarily production code. The distinction there being production code is code that's going to be used by other people, and research code is primarily used by the developer or his or her own group. And through this survey, we also identified 4 key problems that these developers said they faced in developing software. One was rework, having to fix things. Performance issues, not surprisingly, regression, so breaking something when they fixed something else, and then forgetting to fix bugs that weren't tracked. So they identified problems, they didn't track them, and they forgot to go back and fix them. So based on this survey, we did a second survey to follow up, because what was interesting is we saw that people said that they had enough software engineering knowledge to do their job, but they had all these problems. And so our question was, without telling people what software engineering practices address which one of these problems, we went back and asked them how much they knew about different software engineering practices to see whether they really did they know what they really thought they knew. So again, we did another survey that had a number of responses here, and as I just mentioned, we gave them a number of software engineering practices. I'll show you on the next slide the ones that we asked them about. And we started off with giving them a definition to make sure we were talking about the same thing. Because a few conversations I've had with people here, probably the same experience of you, terminology is a big issue. We say the same word and mean very different things. So we gave them a definition and said, this is what we mean when we call this practice. Do you agree with our definition? And whether or not you agree, use this definition to answer the rest of the survey. And actually, most people did agree with our definition. So I don't know how much of the details you can see of this picture, but what you can see along the axis there, all the different practices we asked about, and they address different ones of those problem issues. Some address rework, some address regression, et cetera. I actually didn't mark them on here in the paper we wrote. You can see all those details. What you can see is, in general, the people that were doing research code found the practices less useful than those doing production code, which again, that's not surprising. And you can see a range of the usefulness of things. Some people were very familiar, they thought it was relevant and they used, and others, as we go down to the bottom, were much less useful, or much less familiar even. So this kind of gave us some insight into the fact that people may not know as much as they think that they know. Okay, and again, there's some more details in those papers, and I can talk more about that later if people are interested. The second set of things I want to talk a little bit about in terms of background are case studies. So we did a number of case studies of scientific and engineering projects, and the goal here was to support scientific developers. And this wasn't an assessment to say whether they were good or bad or anything like that, but the goal was really to look at these projects, get some characterizations of them, see what they were doing, try to understand what practices they had used that were working well for them, anything they had tried that was not working well. So it was really just to kind of characterize the domain and understand what was going on. So it wasn't to assess them, say good or bad, and it was also to provide feedback to the teams. So I'm going to give you a few examples here in a second. In all these cases, we tried our best not to make quality judgments, to say that was a bad idea. So some of the things I report from the results are things I don't necessarily agree with, but they're the outcomes of the studies, and you may see some things you don't agree with as well. So this is a real quick overview of the different projects that were included in this survey. And the reason I show this is just to show a little bit of the diversity of the projects that we examined. The bird names mean nothing except it's a way to anonymize, and we can give them nice little pictures. So that's what this is. But you can see lots of them. Most of them are simulations of various kinds. Some are more engineering. Some are a little bit more scientific. Their length, they've got varying durations. Number of releases varies. The size of the team. So all of these were, except for the Eagle one, I believe. All of these were actually production projects, production code that people were using. The Eagle one was more of a demonstration of can this actually be done? And if it could, then they might go build a real code for it later. So a wide variety of things. And the lessons learned that I'm going to show you, again, I have a whole series of them in a paper. I'm just going to pull out a few of them. And these were not ones that came from any one particular project. They're things that we saw in common across multiple projects. And the other caveat I'll say is these projects were mostly DoD-centric, mostly high-performance computing projects, although not necessarily all of them. And so some of these lessons learned, you may or may not see them in the projects that you've interacted with or on your own projects because the context is different. But I think some of them are fairly clear. And in fact, some of the things that I've got here, I've heard mentioned at different times during the HEP workshop and other things today. So some of these might be of interest. So just for a little break, I've got a couple Dilbert cartoons to introduce some of these. So I'll let you take a second and read this one. So hopefully all of our V&V experiences are not quite like this, although I've maybe heard a few that weren't so far off from this. So some of the things that we observed about verification and validation, one is that it varied a lot in terms of formality and completeness. So some people focused only on the core algorithms. Some people did things more with the user interfaces. Some people did both. Some people did very little. It also varied a lot in terms of what % of the code was actually tested. who did the testing. There were some teams that actually had people on their team that were dedicated testers. There's other ones that use the model of, well, I'm just going to let my users test it and tell me what's wrong with it. And the other thing that was really interesting, and again, this may be of value to you, is whether the V&V was required by the sponsor was a big factor. Because in fact, a lot of cases, it wasn't required by the sponsor, and there wasn't funding to do it in the project. And so even if the team had wanted to do it, they couldn't do very much of it because that's not what they were giving funding to do. And we also found the perception that many of the existing techniques, when I say existing, I mean things that traditional software engineers use, those were not useful for various reasons. And so, here's a quote from somebody that V&V is very hard because it's hard to come up with good test cases. So using some of the traditional software engineering practices didn't work out as well. Here's another quote about somebody's view of it. I've tried to position Condor, which was one of the projects, to the place where it's kind of like your trusty calculator. It's an easy tool to use, but unlike the calculator, it's only 90% accurate. You have to understand that the answer you're going to get is going to have a certain level of uncertainty in it, but the neat thing about it is that it's easy to get an answer, at least in the general sense, to a very difficult problem. So that's a very different view of V&V than a traditional software engineer might take. And again, I'm not saying if that's good or bad. This is the one that I like the most, I think. We have a rule of thumb. We plot 2 lines, and if they're close, then it's okay. That's a bit of a different type of V&V than I would have thought about. And then the last one, it's an engineering judgment as to which errors are important and which ones are on the margins. So it's kind of a different perception. And so some of the implications from this, as I said before, some of the traditional software testing methods are not sufficient. And we also need methods that ensure the quality and the limits. So it's not just does it work, but when does it work and when are you going beyond when it should be used? And so some of the suggestions that we had in this work was maybe inspections, code review, and I could talk more about that. I have an example of that later, might be useful. Maybe a little bit more formal planning, maybe some regression suites might be useful in these cases. Okay. Second one I want to talk real briefly about is what are the development goals? So going into this, we thought performance would be the primary goal for most of these projects because they were running on a supercomputer. But multiple goals were important. So we found out that portability and maintainability, at least in some definition of maintainability, were actually quite important because in these situations, the platform changed underneath the code many times. And so if they did not make it portable, if they tuned it very specifically to one machine, then when they ported to the next machine in a few years, many of those tunings wouldn't work. And so they would find that was wasted effort. So they spent time making it portable and trying to do some tuning that was tuning on the algorithm and not necessarily tuning to the specific hardware. So their success depended upon being able to port to new machines. And so a couple of the implications here is, again, that the motivations for these projects are a little bit different than traditional IT projects. And so the methods that are chosen have to fit these goals. And it may or may not be the same ones that we think about in more traditional software. Okay. The third lesson that I want to talk a little bit about is agile methodology. So here's another Dilbert cartoon for a break. So how many people in here are familiar with agile methodologies, or at least the term? Okay. So when we looked at these projects, most of them were not familiar with agile methodologies. Again, none of them came from the software world, so they didn't even know what these things were called. But as we looked at them, realizing that, and again, this is probably common with some of the projects you deal with, requirements constantly change. Maybe some general things are fixed, but as you learn more and more, the requirements evolve. And so the agile type software development methodologies are geared towards dealing with change. And one of the reasons this came out is many of these projects had been told by management, somebody had come in and taught them about the waterfall method, and so the management told them, you need to do all this stuff. And so part of the benefit of us telling them this was giving them some ability to go back and say, that doesn't make sense for our projects because the requirements aren't fixed up front. And the other thing that agile methodologies tend to do, which was important in these projects, is that they favor getting good people and giving them good practices, which are small things, over very heavyweight processes and tools, which they weren't going to use at all. Okay. And what we ended up finding out as we talked to them is that what they described to us as their way of operating was actually agile, even though they didn't know what it was. They weren't doing it on purpose, they were just operating that way, and that turned out to be the best way for them to work. So again, some of the implications for this is if we're going to use software engineering methodologies in science, we've got to make sure that those fit. And we've got to make sure they're appropriate and they're flexible and they're tailored. And again, things that are more inspired by Agile might make more sense and be more appropriate than something that's more structured, more waterfallish. Okay? All right, so the last Dilbert cartoon and lesson learned here. All right. So the question that came up here was, what tools are people using? Are they using more modern, Eclipse editors? Are they using VI in the command line? Not to say one is better or worse, just what are they using and why? And so they weren't using IDEs much. And so here was a quote, all of these IDEs try to impose a particular style of development on me and I'm forced into a particular mode. Okay, so the scientist or the engineer didn't like the way that it was making them work. So in general, they preferred at least what they perceived as the flexibility of the command line. In some cases, I agree, the command line may be more flexible because you can string out all your parameters. In other cases, the IDE might be. I think some of this had to do with the fact that they didn't understand the IDEs and they didn't want to learn something new. Some of it may have actually been a real reason. Because again, they believed that they were more efficient typing, which again, in some cases, they might be. But some of the implications about this is that we just have to, at least in this case, had to remember that they didn't trust the IDEs to automatically perform a task in the same way they would do it manually. So some of the people told us, when I click on that button in the IDE, I don't know what it's doing. But I know if I type this command, I know exactly what it's doing. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I think the bottom line, though, is people prefer to use what they know rather than change. And so that's a sociological conclusion, and that affects, I think, a lot of the work in trying to use appropriate practices, is that people prefer to know what they use rather than change. And that's not just in software development, that's any of us in any particular situation. Okay, so let me spend a few minutes talking about the workshop series now. And I should say there's a whole bunch of other lessons learned that we got from those projects, that I've got a longer paper that explains all those. I just kind of wanted to pull out a few that seemed most relevant, most interesting from some of the discussions that I've seen this week. So the workshop series, if you're interested in seeing something about it, you can go to this website up here. I'll talk a little bit more about it here in a second. But the goal of this workshop series, it's been going for maybe 10 years or more. And what we've tried to do in it is facilitate interaction between software engineers and computational science. So in some sense, it's not the same as what's been going on here with the HEPCS meeting, because it wasn't trying to produce a particular proposal for something. But the goal is to try to get people together talking, because there's some problems that exist that need input from both sides. And as we looked around, we found there's very few venues where these two kinds of people are in the same place at the same time. It just doesn't happen that often. So we've held this workshop most commonly at ICSE, which is the Software Engineering Conference, and Supercomputing. And one time I've held it at the International Conference on Computational Science. I've considered doing it other places, and if anybody has ideas of other places where this workshop might be useful, I'll be happy to hear those, especially if you've got a connection to another community. These are just the ones that I had the best connection to. And obviously, depending on where it's held, it affects somewhat the participation. When it's at the Software Engineering Conference, you tend to have more people with a software engineering background interested in science and a few scientists. When it's at Supercomputing, we tend to have more HPC people, scientists, Department of Energy people that are at that meeting, and less software engineers. So we get different discussions. And what happens in the workshop, we have papers. We ask people if they want to submit papers. They can either be longer 8-page papers or shorter papers. And part of that is, one, to give people kind of a way to say what they want to. We usually spend the first half of the workshop giving the people that get accepted papers a chance to get up and really quickly, 10 to 15 minutes, kind of get their idea out there. But the main point of the workshop, which we try to devote at least half of the workshop to, is smaller group discussions. So we try to get the software engineering people and the computational science people together in a small group so they can talk about some of these issues so that we can see what happens. So the paper presentations help to motivate that. So over the years, we've had a number of different discussion topics. Many of them repeat from year to year. Sometimes new ones show up. I'm going to give you a sampling of some of the ones that we've encountered, and then I'll give you a little bit of details on a few of them. Most of these workshops, we have a report somewhere if you want to see more of the details of what happened at them. The most recent workshop, we actually talked a little bit about testing scientific software and trade-offs among quality goals, because that's important. You can't choose one without increase one, you decrease another one. So what are the trade-offs and how do we make those done right? What are some of the differences between research software and kind of business IT software? Some of those I've mentioned before. I'll talk a little bit about a few of them that have come out. Some of those won't be very surprising. An important one which is kind of what the workshop's trying to do, but it's also an issue, is how do we talk to each other? We don't speak the same language in general. So how do we make that work better? And then an interesting thing that's come up a few times is, how do you measure the impact of doing some kind of software engineering practice on what the scientist really cares about, which is scientific productivity? I can measure software productivity, but how do we measure the impact on scientific productivity? That's hard. And then reproducibility of results, as you have different hardware and different things like that. That's another issue. So a couple of quick observations from the series of workshops. The differences in the domains, IT and science engineering domains. So, in general, the scientific domains are more complex. So it's not uncommon, at least the people that I've talked to, it's not uncommon. I have a PhD in software engineering. They're talking about a physics problem. I don't even know what they're talking about, right? So you need a PhD in whatever the science is to even understand the problem, much less begin to solve it. And so that's not true for business IT software. I can take just about any software engineering student and go write that accounting software. You've never taken an accounting course? That's okay. They can tell you enough about it to write the software. That's generally not the case with scientific domains because of the complexity. Another thing that's important is that the main focus, at least what I've seen, the main focus tends to be on the science. So if you go ask a software engineering company what they're doing, they're building software. The software is the asset. The software is the goal. They're selling the software. That's not the view in science. The software is important, but it's not always viewed that way. The focus is on the science. So the end goal is the science. It's not the software. And that, again, that's not wrong. It's just different. And so that affects a little bit the way people think about the software. Many projects, not all, tend to have long life cycles, which again has some implications on how you build the software. If things are going to have to live for a long time, things like maintainability do become important. If you're only going to use it one time and throw it away, that's probably less important. But a lot of things seem to live for a long time. A lot of things, and you may have experienced this as well, they start off intending to be, I'm going to use it and throw it away, and then all of a sudden it became useful, and now it's lived for a long time, and it was never planned to be that way, and so that has its own series of problems. In a lot of the scientific projects, you're investigating the unknown. You don't know the answer. If you knew the answer, you wouldn't be doing the work. And so that introduces some risk because you can't plan everything up front. You don't know where it's going to go. That's, again, generally not the case in IT software. And then the developers tend to be quite different because, again, some of it has to do with the domain. Because, again, you can't just take any software engineer and say, go write that software. You can't do that. So most of the developers, or many of the developers, I should say, have deep knowledge of the domain, but typically have lacked little formal software engineering training. Whatever they've learned from the postdoc that was there before them, or they've learned because they made a mistake and they went and figured it out themselves. That's not always the case, but that's a lot of times the case. And the other difference is a lot of times the developers are actually the main users of the software as well. So if I'm working in a consulting company, I know I'm writing software for those people over there, and they're going to use it, I'm not going to use it. But a lot of times if I'm writing software for myself, I tend to view it differently. I tend to view the quality differently. I tend to view the rigor with which I do it differently because I know I can just go fix it. At least that's my perception. And so that affects a little bit how people develop software. So these are some of the characteristics of the domain that seem to be a little bit different between research software and IT software. And there's probably a few other ones, but these are the ones that tended to come out the most. The most recent workshop that we just held at Supercomputing a month or so ago, we talked a little bit about the testing problem, and that's come up a few times before. And these are some of the observations from people in the room. Depending on the software, sometimes the view is that, well, the stakes aren't high enough. Nobody's going to die if this software crashes, unlike the software that's going to control the airplane that I'm flying home on. I hope that it was tested very well, right? So in some cases, the stakes aren't high enough to make the testing important. And the needs differ across domains. Some of it maps back to that first one, but different types of applications have different needs. So some of the things people have focused on is process transparency. So even if I can't test everything, I want people to know exactly what I did. And that way it's a little bit more transparent what was going on. And in fact, another interesting thing was software would be guaranteed not to give an incorrect output. So the statement by somebody is, I'd rather my software crash than give me a wrong answer. Because if it gives me a wrong answer, I don't know it's wrong, so I'm going to take the answer and I'm going to trust it. But if it crashes, then I know it didn't give me a wrong answer. So that was an interesting observation. So how can we help guarantee that the software doesn't give an incorrect output? Or how can we put some boundaries around that? Crossing the communication chasm. So one of the things that's come across, and again, some of this may be the case for some of you, it definitely happened with some of the people back in the case studies that I mentioned. There's a stigma associated with software engineering because the interaction has been, here's a big book of stuff, I'm going to drop it on your desk, do all this, I'll be over here, if you need me, call me. Right? That's not the right answer. But that's a lot of what people that are outside of software engineering, that's how software engineering is viewed. And so hopefully we're changing that a little bit. But so from the software engineer's perspective, we need to make sure that we understand the domain, we understand the specific problems, and that we don't have all the answers. So that's not the goal. But the goal is to learn, like I said in those other projects, what are some computational teams doing that they're doing well that we can capture and document and share with other teams? And where are the problems so that we can make sure we're addressing the right kinds of things? And then how can we describe the concepts in terms that are familiar? Because again, there's a terminology issue. And there is a need for people with expertise in both areas, although I don't know that you're going to find, it's going to be hard to find people that have a deep, deep knowledge of the science and a deep, deep knowledge of software engineering. That's rare. But there's a need for people that have some expertise in both sides. And then from the computational teams, again, part of this goes back to the software engineers. The team needs to realize they have a problem before they're going to be open to needing help. Again, just like anything, if I feel fine and the doctor tells me, well, you need to go eat this apple every day to make you feel better, I say, well, I feel fine, so why should I go eat that apple every day? But if I realize that I'm not feeling well, then yeah, I'm probably going to take that medicine. So it's the same idea. It's more of a sociological problem. If I come and I tell you, you need to do this, it'll make your code better, and you say, well, my code's fine, then you're not going to do that. But if you come to me and say, hey, we're having trouble testing our code, then you're probably open to me saying, well, here's some ways you can test your code better. So there needs to be kind of that interaction. And the bottom one is really the important thing, is that we need some real examples. And there are a lot of them that are out there. I don't think very many of them are documented. Examples of where software engineering practices or approaches have been used in scientific software and that have been successful. Because again, just like anything, you're going to believe things that worked in projects that look like you. And so without having some of those examples, it's harder to convince people that these things will work. Scientific impact. So again, one of the ways or one of the barriers to convincing people to use software engineering practices, well, that's going to slow me down. That's going to keep me away from doing my science. So how do we evaluate the impact on science? And it's hard because scientific productivity, I mean, you can count journal papers. Is that a measure? It's a measure. Is it the right one? I don't know. But scientific productivity and software productivity are not the same. I mean, I can measure the impact on software productivity. I can tell you how much more software you're writing, or how many more lines of code, or how much more functionality you're getting out of fewer lines of code, or how many less bugs you're producing. I can tell you all that, but what does that mean for scientific productivity? And that's the real question. Because part of the problem is that, to sometimes assess scientific productivity, that may take a long time to know whether that insight is actually really important. But in order to justify doing some of these things, you need insight in a short time frame. So people threw out things like, well, self-assessment. So if you have people do a practice, you ask them, did that help you or not? That's not as objective, but it is valuable because, again, if people don't think it helped them, they're not going to use it. And also somebody suggested word of mouth. So that is, if one team's using code reviews and they really like it and they tell their friends down the hall, hey, we're using this practice, you should try it, that's probably a good indication that it's having some impact because you're probably not going to tell your friends to go do something that didn't work for you, if you want to keep them as friends, that is. So anyway, this is definitely not a solved problem, but it's an important one. So just a quick advertisement for the next one. If anybody wants to go to Buenos Aires in May, that's where the workshop will be. This is the workshop website link. You can get to all the workshops you can get to from the seforscience.org page. And you can read a little bit more about that. We'd love to have people from outside of software engineering submit papers, or even if you don't have anything to submit and you just want to attend, that'd be great. Or if you have an idea for something and you're not sure if it fits, contact me and I'll be happy to let you know about whether things fit or not in that. And the other thing, I don't have it on the slide, but I'll advertise right here as well. How many of you are familiar with the Computing and Science and Engineering magazine, CISE? A few of you? Okay. If you're not, it's an IEEE magazine that has both magazine content and peer-reviewed content. Myself and another man edit a software engineering department in that magazine, which takes peer-reviewed papers, so the kind of things you might submit to a workshop if you want to get it in the magazine. And we also produce some editorial content. So if you have any thoughts about any of that, again, it's kind of all in this same topic, so please feel free to talk to me on that. Okay, so the last bit that I'll finish up with here are back to the point I said before of needing more examples of real software engineering practice working in scientific teams. What I've been trying to do more lately and what I like to do more going forward, which again, maybe some of you have some ideas, are more direct interaction. So there's other things that have more kind of been studying the domain, but they haven't been as directly interacting with teams. And so this is one possible methodology that I've used various forms of across different projects, and we could obviously vary it, but one would be have some kind of project team, perform a case study, and that can be rigorous or it can be very light, but the point of that being to see what are the strengths and weaknesses in the process, especially for the weaknesses. Are there things that we can develop that will help address those, and then deploy and evaluate them. And then over time, as we collect these synthesized results, to be able to kind of share them to the community. So that's kind of the vision of where some of this can go. And so I want to show you a couple really quick examples, and then I'll be finished and I'll take some questions. Two that I'm going to show you both involved a student of mine spending a significant amount of time with a scientific team, one over a semester, one over a summer. This one was done over a semester, and I have a student. I had a team that I knew at Sandia that was a scientific team or engineering team, I forget, and they wanted to learn how to do test-driven development. They knew something about it, but they weren't sure how it could work in their particular project because they weren't sure how they would define units. They weren't sure how they would do all this stuff that matters. Does everybody know what test-driven development is? The basic idea is you write the tests first, and that's a way of both specifying the functionality and designing the software. The test fails because you have no code yet, and then you write only enough code to make that test pass, and then you iterate and you kind of refactor and clean up the code as you go along. That's the idea of test-driven development. It's been studied and used a fair amount in traditional software engineering. And so this is kind of the picture of what they did there. I don't know if you could see all that. There's a longer article that I've referenced down there. But basically, like I said, the team decides what functionality they want. They write some test that would verify whether that functionality is working properly. And then they use some different tools in there to work on the code. And you iterate until you get the test to pass. And then, is there any poor code that's there? If so, do some refactoring, make sure it all works. And then update any documentation, and then back to the front and continue to go. So what ended up happening, though, because again, unit testing was hard to define, what they ended up doing was this was a series of partial differential equations. So what they ended up doing was developing 2 tests for each equation. So one is they looked at a small number of steps, and then the other one is they looked at whatever the whole time evolution was. So they kind of tested those 2 cases as their test. And so again, it was successful. It mitigated some of the risks in the changing requirements. The requirements did change a lot. They had a customer who was the scientist that was sitting right there with them that was able to work closely with them. It mitigated that, and they saw it as a success. They saw it being able to accomplish things faster than they had done in other situations. So again, I could talk more about that, and there's more in that article there. And the other one that I'll mention briefly is about peer code review. So in this case, I had a student that spent a summer with a science team at Oak Ridge Laboratories in Tennessee. And this was a team that wanted to do peer review. So again, this wasn't us going and saying you need to do it. It was a team that said, hey, we're interested in that code review thing. We don't know how to do it. And so can you come help us? And so we did. And again, the idea being very simple. You're reading each other's code. And so instead of testing code, code review is I'm reading it offline. And the idea being there's been a number of studies in traditional software engineering that show code reading helps people find different kinds of mistakes than testing does. And so especially, and I've thought for a long time, especially in scientific software where you cannot exhaustively test even if you wanted to, code review would be quite useful because you could potentially see problems in an algorithm that you may not be able to write tests for. You might not know to write the test for. So we thought this was going to be an interesting opportunity. So what my student did is he taught them the peer code review process, which is, again, fairly straightforward. He modeled it. He stayed around. He participated in some of the meetings, and then he kind of turned it over to them and let them take control of it. And so they adopted it, and they continued it on their own. And some of the anecdotal benefits of this, which were really interesting and kind of showed us that this was valuable. The first one, which is what we expected would happen, but was glad to see them tell us it happened, is that they found faults in their code that they wouldn't have tested for. So they fixed problems that they never would have fixed if they had only done testing, because they never would have run that particular test case. But they saw it when they were reading the code. So that's a real benefit. And the second one is, and this from a software engineering perspective was like, this is great, because we didn't even tell them this. But they decided, you know what, we need to write our code the same way so we can all read each other's code. That's a very good software engineering practice, but it kind of came bottom up because they recognized the need for it. And actually, whether they realized it or not, that's going to help them in the long run, because when they have to maintain this code later, the fact that they adopted a coding standard for readability, it's going to be a lot easier to maintain. So it wasn't just easier to review, but it actually helped them in the long run. So that was a really valuable result from my perspective. So just to finish up, I want to give you, those are things that we finished. I'm going to give you 2 quick projects that are in this space that are ongoing work. So we haven't completed any of this yet, but they might be of interest to folks. And these both came as a result of a outgrowing of a Dogstool workshop that Dan and a few others, Matt, were at, that was looking at engineering academic software, which is very related to this topic. So one of the projects that came out of this was trying to understand software work in a domain. So what we're trying to do here is we're going to pick a domain. We're still narrowing down on which one. Probably not something like high energy physics that does a lot of computation, has a lot going on, understands something about what's going on. Probably something that the results may have not been quite as common. And what we want to do is we're going to sample a year of papers from a journal or maybe a conference. And the goal of this is we're going to try to say, okay, what does the software work look like in this domain? How do the people in the domain perceive the software? So we're trying to understand what's going on here. And the idea of software work, we kind of left that intentionally vague. So this is supposed to be papers where some kind of software was developed by the authors, But that doesn't necessarily mean really deep, big software. It could be writing scripts. It could be things like that. So anything where people were actually writing something we would call software. Now, if you're just executing somebody else's code, that wouldn't necessarily fit. But where people are actually doing some authoring of code. What we plan to do is identify these, look through the papers, and do some interviews to try to understand some of the things that I've already talked about, but things about the developers, what kind of process they used, what was their funding model, how does that affect their process, what's the status of the software, did they have to give their code for peer review before they could publish? Most of the cases, the answer is probably no, but that was an interesting question. And then what are some of the lessons learned? And so there's a whole big team of this from around the world that's working on this. You may recognize some of these folks, you may not. This is going to be a big effort, so there's a lot of us that are working on this. And the other one that I'll mention briefly is something called bad by admission code. And this is another collaboration with a few people. And the idea is this is code that the developer actively recognizes that it's deficient. So that means when you check it in, you have a to-do comment or a fix comment. And so what we're doing, the other thing is those are often not fixed, right? Come back and fix this, and we never do. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to compare scientific software to other software in GitHub to understand something like, well, does the frequency of these things differ? Is it more common in scientific software? Is it more common in traditional software? And really, how often are these items not fixed? And so that right now, this is more of kind of a repository mining exercise that we may evolve into something else later. But we're just getting going with this. I've got a student working on it, and then another collaborator that was at the workshop that's in Germany that's working on this as well. So let me summarize, and then I'll see if there's any questions. So the needs in scientific software are diverse and deep. There's not one solution, and they're not simple solutions. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So like I said, these really are not the typical software engineering problems. Some of the software engineering theory and practice will work if tailored correctly, but they're unique problems. They don't have simple solutions. And so, as was evidenced by the couple of examples that I gave with my students, but also talking to many people, successful interactions require time. It's not going to be simple, and they require openness to new ideas, both from the software engineers in terms of how do we solve the problems, what are the problems, what can we learn, and also from scientists that, well, maybe that way that I've always done, it's not the best way. So there's a need from both sides to be open to new ideas. So think a bunch of people that have worked on various parts of this project. And with that, I'll take any questions. I'll just advertise. We do have a Twitter and Facebook page if anybody wants to follow. Mostly we post advertisements about the workshops and information about that. It's not something you're going to get spammed with all the time. But if you're interested or on either of those, please feel free to join us there. And be happy to take questions. And if you don't have time to ask the question now, or if you have ideas later, there's my email address. I'm always happy to hear from you, or if you have questions about the workshop or papers or anything like that. So with that, I'll see if there's any questions. So for those of you that don't know what that is, the Software Engineering Lab was a collaboration between NASA Computer Sciences Corporation, which was the primary consultant building some of their software, and the University of Maryland. So it was from the research side, it was a phenomenal situation because it allowed a lot of research to be done on real projects. So why it wound down, I think it's just a NASA funding priority. I don't think it was that anything went wrong. I think it was that the leadership and the management changed their priorities and they decided to no longer fund that activity. I think it was definitely a good model. It allowed, from the software engineering side, it allowed a lot of studies and research and understanding of practice that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And from the practice side, there were techniques and approaches that were able to be validated in practice as opposed to just having students do it in a classroom. So it was beneficial on both sides, but politically I can't tell you why it ended. But I don't think it was necessarily anything technical. Right? So real quick to back up, that comment was made by somebody in the workshop. That wasn't my comment about this software is not critical enough that testing doesn't matter because nobody dies as a result of the software. That wasn't my comment. That was in the workshop. But I think, yeah, you're raising a good point. If I understand what you're saying, what happens if somebody on the software team leaves, right? I mean, that's a problem in all kinds of software, that tacit knowledge that person has walks out the door. And again, the more software engineering practice, the better things are documented, the less that's a problem. But if everything is completely undocumented and it's all in somebody's head, when that person leaves, all that knowledge is gone. Right. So if you're asking, is that a unique attribute of software and science? I don't think so. It may be a bit more exaggerated because of smaller teams, but it's a problem that the whole software engineering field worries about. But yeah, I mean, if you have a team of a professor and their grad student, and when that grad student leaves, if that knowledge is not documented, which it usually is not, then it's gone, and the next grad student has to start over. So I think it may be maybe even a more exaggerated problem in science, but it's not unique. Yes, so you're right. And so what we're intending to do is pick a domain as a starting point. I mean, the goal would be to replicate this in different domains to try to see exactly that. Some of the questions that we're asking are geared towards seeing if anything's different in the different domains. So yes, you're right. There are differences. We want to start in one place because it's going to be hard enough to understand one domain, and then we want to broaden that.
So there is then
Right, I agree, and we don't have a complete long-term plan of where. I think at this point, we're almost treating this kind of like a pilot study. Can we even get anything useful out of one focus domain? But yes, the hope is if we do, then we'll look at another and try to be as diverse as we can to see what those differences are. So I agree with you, doing that is hard because that's a big change, and most people it's hard to make that big change. But again, I think in the cases where somebody's open to that, yes, there are lots of things that we can learn and we can take from the bigger scale of industry and try to bring it to science. But that's not been the perspective that I've gotten from most people that's even an opening. But again, it may be in certain domains. Oh yeah. But again, whether they work as they're designed in industry, whether they work in science, I don't know, because I don't think people have necessarily tried them, because it's hard to find projects that are open to doing that much kind of process up front. And I think that's the big pull. But I agree with your statement. I think it would be interesting. It would be useful. Yeah, and that may be a good fit for the collaboration with the HCP domain. I think if there's a group that's open to it and bought into it and says, yes, we need to do this and we want to do this, I definitely think that there's a place. And it could serve as one of those good examples of, here's a big group that's a science group, they did these things, and here's how they found them successful, and that might help convince other people to give it a try. So I agree with you, and I think it would be potentially quite valuable. So the short answer to both those questions is no. I don't know. I haven't really looked at how informatics might be bridging that gap, and that could be an interesting thing to look at. I haven't. And in terms of the development environment, so there's been some study and some work done in traditional software engineering looking at various environments. It's not been an area that I've done a lot of work in, so I don't have a specific answer to that. But I think whatever situation you choose for your developers definitely can have an impact. There may be studies that show that the design you said we have all in the same room do reduce defects. I know there have been studies on pair programming, which is kind of the smallest version there, where you've got two people sitting together, and there's been some success in that. And I just don't know about the example that you gave, but it might be quite useful. That's not an area I know much about. That's a good question. So yes, so the case studies were done 10-ish years ago. And so, yeah, they may not represent exactly what's going on today in all cases. What have I seen change? So, I mean, I think I've seen I've seen, at least in the interactions in the workshops, I've seen more people who are more fresh out of school that are more exposed to more computing and software engineering practices than those who went through school 20 years ago in science. And so I think that is going to be a help to some of these problems, that it's not completely brand new. But I still see these problems present. But I think there is some change in the people, just because people graduating and coming out now have been around computing, have been around computers, have been around software for their whole lives, as opposed to the projects that I looked at 10 years ago. Many of them, they may have even started as an experimentalist and picked up computation later, and so it was a complete mind shift. So I think that's probably one of the differences, and probably over time, as that continues to increase, that'll help some of these problems. It may make other ones worse. I don't know.
Okay, well, thank you again.
Thank you.